See there. If we can flick through. And one more. Yeah, this was one question we were going to ask you, but the poll doesn't work. But I want you to think about this, right? First of all, we want to think beyond, and apologies to Cindy, but I am going to get a bit technocratic here. Yeah, I'm a consultant, that's what I do. Is that I'm going to actually think about KPIs and think about measurement, because I'm really interested in the work that we do around responsible recruitment. As we saw right at the start, there's lots of good stats on people who have policies, right? But what are you measuring? Do you find it easy to measure what you're doing as far as implementation of those policies? Right? There's no poll, but imagine there was a poll. Imagine what your answer would be. I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up in the room. But then the next slide, please. I quite want you to actually just very, very briefly, what kinds of KPIs do you use to monitor the responsible recruitment practice, right? And a KPI is adopt a policy is not acceptable in these circumstances, right? Even though you might, there's a few people back there said, damn, we haven't got anything more. But that's fair, right? So while you're doing that online, anybody want to shout out a couple in the room? I'm breaking the rules here, but is that if you want to shout out to anybody, have you got a KPI to demonstrate that things are implemented in practice? Complaints? So is that, Vicky, as far as that goes, is that high complaints, low complaints? What are we looking for here, or does it not matter?
Having complaints, but seeing them go down.
Yeah. So in some ways, quite often it's good to see a big spike in complaints at the start, because that's real success. Yeah? Anybody else? Any others? No? Keep thinking about it. All right, so we're going to move over, Stephen, if you're, and keep putting them in the chat as well, and we'll come back to that later. So introduce Stephen first. I'll let him introduce himself. And with all of the speakers, just so you can know in advance the way we're going to do this, is it's a little bit different to the previous ones. They're going to have about 5 minutes, and I think each one of them has, I think, one slide. I think we gave them 1, 2 maximum slides. And they're going to tell a little bit of a story, right? And then we're going to have a conversation about that, and then we'll move to the next and the next, and then we'll get some sort of questions from both the room and from the internet world. Okay? Great, Stephen, so I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Sorry. So my name's Stephen Slack. I work for WM Morrison Supermarkets, but in the manufacturing division of our business. We have 16 manufacturing sites across the UK, and I think we're in the top 3 for overall food production in the UK, so we're a big player in the UK market. The reason I'm here is because we had a case a few years ago at our site in Derby, which is a flour manufacturing site. We do all the bouquets for all the stores and various third-party customers. And as you can probably guess from the fact it works with flowers, it has 2 really big peaks every year. One being Valentine's Day, where everybody loves to get their roses, and the second being Mother's Day, depending on where you are, depending on what month that falls, but in the UK it's in March. And it always times it right just with the weather as well. So we love a bit of beast from the east and things when it gets to Mother's Day. This particular year though, it was the last day of production, and it was just, we was all kind of winding down and getting ready for celebrating the fact that we delivered the biggest event of the year, and getting back to normal. And I'd not been in the office too long when one of our team managers came up to me and says, I think we've got a problem. And I was like, oh, right. Says, I'm hoping that it was going to be an easy day really today. And he says, I think we've got a child in the factory. And obviously, when you have tripled your workforce over a period of sort of 7 days, you are pulling from wherever you can find that labour. So we work really well with our agencies to ensure that we get the people into the business. And they will go wherever they can to find that. And this particular person and this particular bunch of people had come from somewhere on a bus. Procedures had fallen down, and no one was on the bus to check them in that morning when they were getting on and coming to site, and ultimately someone got on that shouldn't have got on and ended up in the factory. Thankfully, our team managers and our management team had been trained on this and spotted it straight away. The concerning part of it really was that the child didn't realise she was doing anything wrong. She thought it was fine to be there. She thought she was doing someone a favour. She'd been asked just to take her place on the bus that morning, and because there was nothing on the bus and no one checking them in, they'd got to site amongst all the other 600 people that were walking at the same time, walked in and gone straight down to work in the factory. So that then obviously then snowballed, and then we had to go through what we was going to do to make sure that that young lady was protected and safe, which when we went to the agency initially, they just said, oh, we'll get her a taxi. And I was like, I beg your pardon, you'll get her a what?
So that was their remediation?
That was their remediation at that point. They thought they would get her a taxi. And they didn't really kind of kick into gear with thinking about what was actually the issue. It wasn't the fact that she shouldn't have been there, it was the fact that it was a child and all the rest of it. So that kicked off probably the longest day I've ever had at work, which actually ended up being 18 hours long. And we ended up having to go through the police, the GLAA, all the agencies that we have in place all supported us to be able to deal with this. The difficult thing that we found with it was the fact that none of the police actually knew what to do with the child. If it had been an adult, it would have been easier, but because it was a child, it wasn't as easy. This person had got very limited English. She was from a Romanian background, and as far as it was concerned in her community, she was just doing a favour. It also ended up nearly causing the site to lock off, because then the family and all the people that lived amongst them came to kind of get her and rescue her almost. And that's pretty much the story really, but the fact is that if we'd have got things right in the first instance, and if we'd have done the right things before that person had got to site, we wouldn't have ended up in that. The training and all the remediation that you're putting after is all very well and good, but if you don't get your first bit right, which is the recruitment, it doesn't really work. And that's where we then had to and we've spent a lot of time over the last few years making sure that all our systems and our processes are really robust to try and avoid anything like that happening again. And we do monitor them in terms of KPIs. So we monitor all our cases, and we work with various partners across the UK to make sure that we're sharing intelligence and we know what's going off, so we can avoid things getting into and getting in and then having to remediate for those people. We also work with them to help people that have been victims back into work. So we do a lot to make sure that we are protected as much as we can, and then the people that are coming into the business understand properly it is what they should be getting and what they should be doing. But that is pretty much what happened in Derby.
Okay, Stephen. And maybe we could go to the next slide, because I think you've got a slide that I'm glad wasn't on actually when you were talking, because I think people listened rather than read.
Yeah.
But that's some of the information. But we'll come in a minute. We'll come to what you did next and what your lessons were, which I think is really important, as you say. But just maybe to go a little bit around the incident yourself, because that's quite interesting, as you say. One is, so how old was the young person? She
was 14.
14, right. And as you say, there's all sorts of knock-ons, because probably to the agencies, oh well, it's simple. This is one incident. We'll just remove that person from the site. But you say it actually almost involved the community seeing they had to respond as well. So I mean, what did it feel like to you? Because I'm interested, as human beings, in this situation, something like that happens. We can either see it as in a technical way, but presumably that was quite challenging for you personally to have to deal with that day and subsequently as well.
Yeah, I think last time I spoke at a Stronger Together event about this, I said it was the worst day I've ever had at work, and it definitely was. And it's something that has stuck with all the people that were involved, and in fact it probably created relationships and cemented things with our agency providers, because it brought us all together. They'd never had a case like it, we'd never had a case like it. In fact, if that case hadn't happened, we probably wouldn't have tried as much as we do now to get in front of the curve.
Right.
And all the things that have come from it. We didn't even have a proper escalation policy at the time, because we'd never had it happen. So not only was it an unusual case, it was probably the first big case that we'd ever had as a business. So yeah, it did a lot to to bring us all together, and we still talk about it now in terms of the people that was involved in it. It definitely touched all of us that were involved in it.
Okay. And I think, what was the biggest thing that surprised you about, not the incident necessarily, about what happened next?
I suppose it was the fact that because it's the UK, and I can only speak for the UK, I've never worked overseas, so I suppose I never thought it was a problem here. And it brought it close to home that actually it doesn't matter where you are, that people will exploit people regardless of the nationality or country that you're in. And that's why we have to work really hard to stop that being a problem and make it, and I think someone once said it at one of these conferences, it's about being disruptive, and recruitment ultimately is the very start of where we can be disruptive and stop people being able to exploit our businesses and exploit the people that they're bringing into our business. It's really important that we make sure that we get it right from the very outset.
Okay, and then maybe I think that's a really good point actually. Let's take that disruption line, because obviously having disruptive responses is quite often different to having kind of technical or compliance responses. In fact, it's very different.
Yeah.
Can you think of something that you think you've done that is potentially disruptive afterwards?
I think the biggest thing is the amount of stuff we translate and the amount of information that they get from the very outset. There's been lots of people today talk about making sure that there's the apps to tell the employees what they're going to get when they start with you and all that, but it's making sure that they actually truly understand it, and that's the difference. We now make sure that anybody coming in our business can get a contract translated into their own language, where because we were in the UK, you kind of almost think, well, they're here, so that's the way it is, that's the contract, that's what they've got. So we got it translated into as many different languages as we need. We ensure that from the outset that they understand what it is that they're going to get and when to expect it and what it is that we're going to do and what we're going to give them, and what the expectation is from their outside of work life as well. Because if they know that, no one can then pull the wool over their eyes to be able to deceive them into what they should be bringing home.
Okay, so that's about also improving your communication with the workforce.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what about the agency? What's changed with your relationship with either with that agencies or agencies in general?
So to be fair, we still use that agency, and we've gone into another contract with them because actually I believe that their systems and their processes are actually really robust. They work with us on preemptive stuff as well, so they share intelligence that they get and they work with us to make sure that we're up to date with the things that they're finding in their business. So we can check our systems and we can then look into it as well. So it means that we're working really, really collaboratively together to ensure that we're, again, trying to stop anybody infiltrating the business.
Okay. And just one final question, and Sonia, I'll come to you in one second. I know you're waiting patiently, but if you had, we all like time travel movies. My particular favourite is Bill and Ted, obviously. But if you could go back in time, a year before the incident, what one thing would you do a year before the incident?
I think it's to make sure that you're asking the right questions. I assumed our agency had it all in hand in that circumstance, but like us, they're dealing with something that's abnormal to them in that circumstance. And why I thought they had everything closed off and bottomed out, they didn't. And actually, if you've got to ask those difficult questions, even if you think they've got it covered, and it might be something simple, ask it, making sure that you've covered everything off. Yeah. Cover those bases 100% of the time, in fact 120% of the time.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you very much.
And I think it's really good. One of the questions I saw earlier, I think, online, and it wasn't, I mean, Bonnie's picking lots of sort of things, was about the role of HR and why isn't HR more visible? I mean, I think it's great to have Stephen here, because to have actually HR here to talk about what it feels like to manage it, rather than, many of us sit at a slightly abstract level sometimes on these things, yeah. So that's really great. Thank you very much. You can have a little clap, actually, I think. Now, sort of segueing on from that, I'm going to go to Sonia, who's based in Murcia in Spain, and she's going to talk actually about supervisors. So, you know, a segue on from this to talk about the role of supervisors in this. So, Sonia, you're hopefully going to come online on the big screen soon. And certainly your slides are there if you're not. I can see you down on this screen anyway. So, Sonia, if you want to kick off just to explain, you know, what you do and what your role is, and just some of the lessons that you got working with G's, which G's will be known to lots of people, lots of the great work that they do in this field and in fields, as far as actually working on responsible recruitment issues with supervisors in the very specific context that you have in sort of eastern and southern Spain.
Spain. I'm from the ethical compliance team here, and my work is to verify workers' conditions, do internal audits, to supervise our supply chain, and one of our bases is to do training on workers' recruitment, and it's what I'm going to explain here today.
Great. Okay, so if you want to just sort of kick off, if you want to walk through, I think you've got a slide as well. So
yes,
if we can
only
sort of
one,
click
actually.
to the next slide to work through what kind of things you've been working with on supervisors to embed your sort of principles and your approach as a company as far as responsible recruitment practice, and what kind of impacts those have had as well.
Okay, we based our training responsible recruitment in step 3 and 4 that you will see in the slides, that it's on local recruiters, applicants, and on interviews. So the basis on the training is to recognize modern slavery signs and difference with labor exploitation. And this is so important because we focus our training on being able, so the person that we've got in front understands what is modern slavery and the difference between modern exploitation. Of course, in the onboarding with the workers, once they are hired, they also have another training related with this. But in this case, it's only with responsible recruitment. We teach them on our ethical commitments, in our ethical trade policy, and we focus this training in the areas of major risk. Which are the areas of major risk? Discrimination, not to discriminate anyone on the interviews, to be able to detect vulnerable workers who are the ones on risk to have their rights breached, to detect identity documents and to detect those who are false, to detect in this recruitment process if workers are paying for any service to an intermediary or someone in the company. In this case, we register all the intermediaries. Also, to be aware of language. So, in case workers are coming and they are not speaking in the language of the interviewer, we always train them that they need to look for someone to translate, never someone who has bring those workers. And we focus also in that they need to understand that modern slavery and labor exploitation can happen in this company. So in this case, we teach them in yellow flags how to raise yellow flags and to use the whistleblowing channel. And one of the most important things is to train all workers and also recruiters on which are workers' rights. So from my work, I think that the benefits of this training is that these practices are monitored. This means that if someone in the company thinks that they can breach the law or they can have a look for money to bring workers to our company, if we teach them that from, in this case, yes, we are having a look to those issues, maybe this will stop them. Then we empower team leaders in good ethical practice, and we make them to have teams that trust in their work. they understood workers' rights and we empowered them to follow the workers' rights. Then they offer confidence on their teams, and we offer them also interview skills, so they are able to detect identity theft, monitoring who brings workers, tips to recognize false documents. And another good practice is to include in the Europe description of these recruiters to be a recruiter as part of their job role. So the company is paying them. Then we teach them on yellow flags. Once they are hired, they continue reporting if one of the workers in the interview, they have suspects of something not being well. So they continue using the whistleblowing channel to raise yellow flags.
Okay, great. I mean, that's all sort of very broad and very impressive. I mean, ask you a question directly. If how successful do you think it is, and what are the challenges for the supervisors once they've received, this training and the support that you give them? When does it work, and when doesn't it work?
Well, I think it works, this training works very well, and actually people who receive the training, they get surprised. How can someone of your same nationality can earn money for a vulnerable worker? Mm-hmm. And the major problem that from all these years is that I have listened so many times saying a co-worker that maybe has came with another person with false documents is saying that I was doing a favor. Mm. So they are not thinking that that is bad and the implications of doing that, and that maybe someone can help in that situation. So we need to build trust from workers, supervisors, and company to be able to control all this industry.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. That's a common factor already between there. That the thing straight back was I was doing somebody a favour, and obviously looking beyond that is really super important to get what's really happening there. And I think, are there ways, as far as the supervisor is concerned, because you can either see the supervisor as a problem or a solution, and I think you're looking at them as a solution here, which is great. But what can you do to have them sort of play an even stronger role? And how do you also call out supervisors who are particularly good at this and get them to mentor or support other people, or people have a particularly strong moral view?
Yes, the problem are with the new ones that are no more used to this training, but the ones who are with us for so many years, they understand that they've got an ethical team that when they are seeing any sign of modern slavery or labor exploitation, they are calling us. And I think that is our win, having people consulting us before doing anything.
Okay, great. And one final question, and then we'll go sort of straight down the date line to Johannesburg. And it's maybe a question for you to think about, Stephen, as well, and probably Evan as well. But I think, in all three countries, UK, Spain, and South Africa, there are lots of commonalities here as far as labour markets, migrant workers, elections. South Africa's just come out of a very sort of fractious election. UK's just going into an election, I believe. And Spain seems to have been in elections almost constantly for the last 3 years. Yeah. And one issue there is obviously political narratives around migrants from certain parts of the political spectrum. And I know in Spain, obviously, from some of the right parties, there is a very defined narrative around migrants. How do you work around that to actually work on the point that I think a few people have made previously? We're talking about human beings here. And how do you actually use this to kind of better humanize actually your colleagues who may not be, from Spain originally?
That is a very good question, and it's so difficult to answer, because our situation in Spain is that every day people think that immigration is coming to Spain, in this case, in a bad way. And what people in agriculture companies are saying is that this is people that want to work, and we need to put them things easier to work here in Spain. And the thing is that politicians are not letting us have a good way to hire them or to bring workers out from Spain to be able to work here, because Spanish people do not want to work in agriculture. So we need workers, and we need to empower their rights and to let them work.
Okay, good. And we'll perhaps come back to that, because it's a very similar narrative that I think probably hasn't been heard enough during the selection campaign, actually. There are other narratives we hear. So going to go to Evan now. Is obviously, like I said, as far as South Africa is concerned, and if you can explain to us a little bit, Evan is the Africa Programme Manager, Stronger Together, will be known to some, maybe many of you. And I think if you can just actually start by explaining a little bit of what the context and the situation is in South Africa, and I know you've got a couple of slides as well, particularly in the relation to the role that migrant workers play in South Africa, but also some of the challenges you see around responsible recruitment issues.
Yeah, just to give an overview, I think South Africa very similar to the previous two speakers. One thing about South Africa is that we have a long history of cheap and exploitable labor, particularly in high labor-intensive industries, which sort of form the foundation of modern South Africa. Within agriculture specifically, there's a prevalence of antiquate labor practices, which present significant risks, particularly when it comes to recruitment. And if I can ask, just for the first slide, I can just give an overview of sort of what I see on the ground and sort of where businesses in the agri space, how they do recruitment. I think what is important is that, to mention right at the beginning, is that recruitment is not homogeneous. It differs from one area to the other, depending on where business is located. But generally speaking, you either do sort of internal recruitment or external recruitment. And in both cases, there are significant risks. So internally, it will be the agribusiness, the owner, the farm managers, or HR that would recruit. One could also add supervisors there that would recruit workers. In other cases, one could outsource labor to labor contractors, or as we refer to them in South Africa as temporary employment services. These are oftentimes not well-regulated businesses. They operate very informally. And in some very remote areas, it's not uncommon for businesses to engage local tribal leaders to access labor from local communities. And each of these cases, it presents significant risks to a business. And so the message that we always say is that, regardless of what recruitment model you operate, one needs to be aware of the risks associated with that. Added to that, and we can perhaps go to the next slide, is sort of the broader context in which recruitment happens. I think to link on to your last question, Steve, around sort of the broader socio-political context, one needs to understand that businesses don't operate in a bubble. So again, South Africa, we've got a history of migration, both internally, within provinces, but also across borders, where workers historically would look for work in sectors like mining and agriculture. And these cross-border movements presents at times quite a big risk, because we have very porous borders in South Africa, both land as well as sea borders, and those migrant corridors are often hotbeds for exploitation from recruiters or transporters who receive potential workers into paying recruitment fees or lying about potential what the actual jobs entail. You also have issues with irregular migrants, or as we more generally understand them, undocumented foreigners. In South Africa, we've seen quite a lot of fraudulent work papers. So linking up with Sonia said, I think I sympathize with a lot of business where you have all these processes in place, but fraudulent papers and how people pay either local South Africans to use ID documents, or they forge documents that look very legitimate. And if you are not well trained to spot fraudulent papers, you could put your business at risk. And then there's also the broader issues around criminal syndicates that operate through these fraudulent schemes as well. At a policy level, within agriculture, one has seen corporate work permits become extremely challenging to acquire. So historically in South Africa, particularly during peak harvest season, it's not uncommon that some businesses would have been exempted from employing migrant labor from neighboring countries. There was a policy agreement in place at a national level. But over the years, we've seen, given South Africa's challenge with unemployment and poverty, there's sort of it's become more challenging to acquire these work permits as government is trying to push for more local employment. But in areas where it's difficult for business to access local labor, there is a necessity to use migrant labor in various sorts. And I think that unethical recruitment can happen at various stages within the recruitment process, from pre-selection, during the employment, as well as post-termination. And it's important that businesses are aware of these risks that might present itself. Just a few examples on the screen. We had a case last year within the agriculture sector where a farm owner, his son, and his two supervisors were recruiting women and children from Mozambique to work in one of the provinces. This is currently a case before the courts on charges of people smuggling and human trafficking. The workers were not eligible to work. And in many instances, they were deceived about the conditions under which they arrived at the farm as well. So, unfortunately, it is a reality that can happen within our space as well.
Okay, that's super useful, and I'm just going to sort of unpack that a little bit in a minute as far as documentation and legal pathways to employment. But just open it perhaps with a broad sort of question to you, Evan. I mean, as far as working on responsible recruitment, which obviously you do, from Strong Together and all the great work that Strong Together does, what do you think the biggest challenges are? If I said what are the two biggest challenges in actually making progress in this area, what are they for you personally?
Yeah, I think, and again, this one probably, Stephen, it extends beyond just businesses. I think if you look at the labor migration process, it can be quite long and complex. And because of this complexity at times and sort of the challenges it is to legally acquire eligibility to work, can lead to instances where we take the shortcut in many instances. There's also issues around migrant corridors that I mentioned previously, where there are certain notorious areas in South Africa along our borders where people are preyed on through vulnerability and desperation. So given these the assumption that South Africa is seen as a land where people can acquire work or acquire jobs, but we are dealing with significant challenges of our own. And so, when people are desperate for work, they will agree to work under any conditions for any amounts of pay. So I think there's the legal side and supporting businesses that want to do the right thing. I'm talking about issues around corporate work permits as well, And that's they really need assistance from sort of your broader government departments. I also think another challenge is that sort of when you are entering low-wage occupation, it can become quite difficult or easy to get into debt, which makes it challenging for that employment to help in terms of upward mobility, right? So a lot of the times I hear, that businesses, they have good processes in place, they've got policies, they do their due diligence, but they're not always aware of potentially workers having to pay a transporter exorbitant amounts of money to cross the border to enter South Africa, and also where to then seek assistance. So then it becomes a vicious cycle where that employment is just enough to pay off debts that they might have, and in that way doesn't really contribute in a meaningful way.
Okay, that's great. And one final thing, and then we'll just move to a sort of more general conversation. Can you think of any specific sort of good practices that you've seen from businesses in South Africa and Southern Africa? And particularly if you can bring out things just with your experience that are a bit unique, if there's anything or innovative that you've seen people do.
Yeah, I think from the work that we've done, I mean, the agriculture specifically, there's been a lot of good work. I think a lot of companies are committed to ensuring that workers don't pay recruitment fees, that they properly onboarded. So recruitment is never just a one person's responsibility. A lot of the businesses, they're using teams and sort of managers, supervisors, but also having a follow-up through extensive inductions, making sure that the business's positions explained to them. But I think one thing I found very encouraging with a lot of our businesses is when they're employing migrant or temporary or seasonal work during harvest season. It's sort of a 3, 6, 9 month employment in the year. It's how do we create a sustainable model in which those workers consistently have work every season. So instead of going through the extensive process of trying to recruit people again or recruit new people, many businesses would sort of detailed labor records of previous employees that worked at the farm, that worked within the companies, within the pack houses. And they would often use that as a means to acquire labor again for the following season. And a lot of the times, workers would know that come a particular point in the year, there is regular work at this specific site. And that sort of provides a sense of sustainability and security for businesses. Also added to that is that a lot of businesses are talking to one another. So when it's not their peak season, they are referring seasonal temporary workers to different sites where they can receive another period of employment. And I think that for me is really important because it reduces vulnerabilities and risks. So workers don't have to work or not have work for 6 months of the year, which only heightens vulnerability. So that consistent work is definitely a positive that I've seen in our agriculture space.
Okay, that's really good. And actually, I want to bring that out to you, Stephen, and to Sonia as well. So I think there's that sort of drawing a couple of things out from some of that conversation, I think, is that the idea of consistency, the idea of certainty, and also the idea of legality, comes through a number of those, that if actually you can have workers who are legal, and that's about government, and government actually sort of make it easier to be legal sometimes, I think, but also have some certainty about where they're working and consistency. That kind of works for workers and it works for employers as well. Now, how do you see it in the UK in the current situation? Because obviously there's been a couple of quite significant shocks to the UK labour market in the last 6 years, I think, and we all know what those are. But I mean, how has that impacted on you as far as working as an HR people person in where you get your workers from? And are there things you think that government could do better? We've got an election next week to actually make it easier for you to recruit people ethically and legally. Just a small question, yeah.
So to be fair, since COVID and I don't want to say it was a recession because I don't think they kind of declined that fact on me. It's not a recession. Labour's been easier to find.
Right.
We've not struggled as much as we thought we probably would do over the last sort of 12 to 18 months. I think we're not quick enough at granting visas to migrants as they come in that want to work, and we could do far better with that than we currently do. I think we should be granting more of the visas that allow you to come in for unskilled work instead of it being as specific as it has been around specific industries like the meat industry and things like that, because I do think businesses are still crying out for it. And we are seen as a country where people want to come and work, and we could do so much more to help with that. And I think the fact that we have made it harder is allowing, again, so you look at the settled status scheme that we rolled out after Brexit, there still doesn't seem to be a clear monitoring process for pre-settled status, if you've gone home, if you've come back. There is so much more we need to do to get to grips with it, and I think from speaking to some of the agencies, they are using the pre-settled status and the settled status schemes to go and recruit back in Europe, which again leaves us probably open to exploitation and then people not doing the right thing. So we probably should do way more with and have some more rules around that, I would think, and some more legislation. They don't seem to be very forthcoming at the minute with the settled status what's going to happen with it, because if you're employed you're fine, if you're not employed you have to prove it, but if you then go home you can and then decide to come back, it kind of puts you in a position to get back in with the wrong people.
Okay. And Sonia, for you, as far as Spain is concerned, I'm asking this because you mentioned also the point of the difficulty in getting sort of, if you like, risk-free, and that's risk to you, but particularly risk to workers, of actually sort of pathways to employment and legal employment. Do you think either Madrid government or regional governments are open to what you need, and do you think they support what you need in terms of either visa and pathways to legal employment?
Well, we will take into the point that they will need to do something, because otherwise we won't have workers to harvest our products. So in that point, I think they are starting to put measures from the central government, but in the cases of the regions where they are not the socialists, it's been harder.
Okay. We'll go to look at perhaps some of the online questions now. But while you're coming up, I'll just mention for those of you who are from or live in the UK, is that on the sort of the skills sort of visa point, I think there was a very good point on the radio. There was a farmer on the radio last week which made the really strong point. The concept that going and working really hard all day in difficult conditions is not a skill, right? It's not a skill I possess. Right? And I think it is a skill, and actually we should be able to. There's really something quite nasty about actually that distinction of skill and not skill in this context and how we define it.
And then salary expectations,
yes,
all then restricts it even further.
Exactly. Bonnie.
All right. Hi, Steve. So I'm going to ask this question in terms of a story.
Okay.
So this came from earlier, and I think it's perfect for this panel on practical realities. So you're an employer in a country with job mobility, or as the person who asked this question said, visa portability, different terms. It's a key right for migrants, and it's something that we advocate, where they're not tied to the sponsor of their visa. So in some countries, in some contexts with this, perhaps the employer is more hesitant about paying the cost of travel and recruitment if they are not sure the worker would stay and they would see their investment collapse. So can you talk a little bit about perhaps solutions you've seen that could mitigate some of these risks and safeguard company investments? Yeah, is that, do you have time for another one, or is that enough of a story to get us started?
Let's start with that one and
Okay.
throw it around the panel and then come back through. So perhaps I'm going to start with you, Evan, actually. So perhaps if I summarise to get it right on here, so you're an employer, you know the employer pays principles, you know that you should be paying the fees, that workers shouldn't be paying the fees, but you see that as a cost and an investment. And I think particularly in kafala type environments, then we've heard that a lot. You know, I can't transition because the workers will disappear and it's a waste of my investment, is what you hear, yeah? So, Evan, what about that? What do you do with employers? And obviously you work with a lot of employers and with other agencies to convince the employer, it's the right thing to do, but also it's a commercial sensible thing to do to be paying for recruitment and not to have workers paying for fees.
I think that's an extremely challenging one. We don't come across that quite a lot in South Africa, but we have had instances where companies invest in the development of their staff through work schemes and bursaries and the likes, and then there's sort of this expectation that those skills would then benefit the company, and then what happens in instances where they perhaps end up leaving or do not study something that might be beneficial to the company. I think having clear communications around what is expected and being open and transparent in that recruitment process is very important. So you make it clear from the beginning the expectations on both sides, from the employee side as well as those seeking employment as well. And then having clear guidelines in terms of when recruitment fees are paid, that workers or job seekers understand that it's not just that there is a cost involved in this process. So for me, that would be a good starting point is having open and transparent conversations around costing and the cost associated with recruitment with potential job seekers.
Okay. Well, I mean, Stephen, it might be with this group, I'm just thinking whether that's, the scenario might be a little bit not there, but I'm going to ask, I mean, have you had instances where you've found that there's recruitment fees being paid and you've stepped in to either repay or deal with that? Not
specifically. We did do some overseas recruitment probably about 2 years ago now with the meat visas, because we have 3 meat sites within the manufacturing business. And what I can say is we paid for everything. So we covered all the costs of the travel, the accommodation, all that kind of stuff. We did the right thing. I think if you are an employer and you're frightened that then your investment's going to leave, do better.
Be a better employer.
Is that?
Yeah.
To me, if you treat them with the respect that they deserve, and make them welcome and do all the right stuff, your investment's not going to walk off, is it? So that would be my advice. Do better.
Yeah. Simple. Very good.
Thank you. So we have another question, and it's going back to what you said about if you could go back in time. So this question, plays on that. So Stephen, if you could go back in time and the child in question was not alone, but rather she's at the factory with her parents, would you have done things differently? And if so, what would it have been? And then we have the last question for Sonia, which is, what can we do to help you in your work? What do you need? How can we spotlight what you're doing, given the fact it's a sector of work that most Spanish people, from your description, don't seem to care very much about? So we'll leave it with that, yeah?
Great questions. Thank you, the internet.
Me?
Yeah.
The answer is no. Her mum did come for her as part of the day. And ultimately, we did find out that the police ended up putting her back with the parents. But for me, we did everything that we should do to protect that child. She had a right to education, she had a right not to be working, she had all the rights that any other child should have. So no, I wouldn't change anything. If anything, I'm upset that the system failed and then didn't help her to find the support that she needed to escape the situation she was in.
And Sonia, what do you need? What could help you?
I'm also open to suggestions. This is a value added to every company who is looking for ethics and looking for workers' rights. So what we need is that internally and externally to have our work recognized and to be happy of those companies that have an ethical team that are aware of human rights.
Okay, great. And I think, you know, sharing here, I mean, all of the sharing that's happening in these 2 days is really important to actually sort of deal with that as well. So I'm going to break with the rules now, because we missed out our polling, which was great, because we've got 5 minutes more. So I'm going to just actually ask to the room as well. You can ask questions with your voices, yeah, rather than your thumbs. Yeah. So any questions from the room? You weren't planning for that, were you? No?
We still have questions.
Oh, you still got them online, have you?
I think it's hard for people to ask without the mic.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I think we'd rather have them on.
Yeah.
Okay. So this question's about piecework.
Yeah.
Does the practice of having piecework, does it incentivize exploitation in a way? Does it act as an incentive to hide exploitation?
Okay. Yeah. So the question for piecework, and just checking, okay, for Evan and Sonia, you know what we're meaning when we're meaning piecework? Yeah, great. So do you have piecework? Question one. And if so, do you think it incentivizes exploitation? It's a question to all three of you.
We do, but it's on top of minimum wage, so it's different over here. In terms of it's not their sole wage. They have to be paid minimum wage and then they earn on top. And it only happens in one of our sites. And it's to do with an industry practice in fish. So, and it's to do with shelling, I believe. It's not something I'm very familiar with, but yes, it does. And I don't believe it does. I think if you do it right and you've got the right base level, it shouldn't incentivise it now.
But do you have any different levels of either risk assessment or monitoring where you have piecework with that in mind?
No, I don't believe we do, so it's probably one to look at.
Okay. Sonia, what about you? Do you have piecework and payment per produce or kilogram?
Yes, but here in Spain, to pay only through piece rate is illegally. You need to maintain working hours, and you need to pay piece rates as an extra.
Okay, so it's on top of the minimum wage that you pay already, yes?
Yes.
Okay.
We are paying working hours,
do we
and
see
then
the piece rates?
piece
What
rate.
role does it play, and does it drive exploitation?
Yeah, so I think very similar to Stephen's point. So it's not sometimes in some areas piecework is used, but with a lot of the industry bodies that we work with and sort of the guidelines around piecework, it's over and above the minimum wage. So businesses should not be using it as a way to sort of underpay employees. So having that as sort of as a practice, but still complying to sort of basic labor laws and giving business guidance around that as well. I think it does present a challenge at times, particularly in South Africa, but I think globally as well, that labor has become more expensive, and so you sort of cut back on working hours, shifts, employment periods, and we're using piecework as a way of incentivizing workers to produce. But I think there's quite clear guidelines in South Africa that over and above basic minimum wage is a minimum threshold.
Great. Thanks very much. I think I'm going to sort of round it up there and thank all of the speakers, on my behalf and your behalf as well, because I think it's really useful to have this sort of, deep dive into the practicalities. And there's a couple of things I think come from the conversations. And one of the ones I think generally, I think, and particularly seen from yours as well, is just let's not forget how important it is to have escalation routes and safeguarding routes, because we can talk a lot about risk and prediction and processes. But when we have critical instances like this, we owe it to human beings to be able to respond quickly or to get them to people who can actually respond to them quickly. And I think that's something as well that you said, Sonia, with the yellow flags is, you know, you raise the yellow flags, but then you need to do something, yeah? And particularly when the red flags are there. So feel free, obviously, to reach out sort of in relation to Sonia and Evan separately to continue conversations, and also recommend as well for those of you sort of in the room over coffee, unless you have to run away early, to speak to Stephen as well. So thank you for all the questions that came in, and thank you for a great session. And thank you to the guys in the back behind the glass. As I was sort of pointing higher and higher, they did their best to actually get the sound as we got it here, and I know it's not ideal. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. Sorry.
Well done, Sonia.
I sit here? Yeah?
Okay,
All right.
it's 3 o'clock. Right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Vicky Bowman, a senior advisor at Institute for Human Rights and Business, and we're going to have a short panel before lunch, before coffee. I need coffee. On migrant workers in conflict-affected countries, and it would be myself and Rakesh, who you heard earlier on this morning, who I hope is out there somewhere. Rakesh, are you there? And Vincent Bernard, who is from ICOCA, and he'll explain a little bit what ICOCA is for those of you who haven't come across it before. So we're going to address this topic from a couple of angles. The angle of workers going to work in conflict-affected countries in commercial supply chains, so in the private sector, whether it be in construction or manufacturing or agriculture. But then we're going to do a deeper dive into those who are going to go and work in the private security sector. And so obviously in that area, it's as much around clients who are governments and aid agencies and non-private sector actors as it is the private sector, but they are still migrant workers and they're being affected in similar ways and treated in similar ways within that supply chain of private security. If we could, or can I move it to the next slide, or the first slide? How do I do that? Take control, audio visual. Okay, there you go. So just to say that we're going to be mainly looking at Rakesh's observations of what he's seeing of migrant workers travelling from South Asia to the Middle East and to Russia, Ukraine. But I also want to just flag up that tomorrow we have a session which will include my colleague Thithi Thane talking about migrant workers moving from conflict-affected areas from Myanmar. And that's already come up several times in the course of today as being a very significant source of migrant workers within Southeast Asian supply chains and beyond there in Gulf, in Northeast Asia as well. So Rakesh, turning to you, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're observing in terms of trends for migration corridors to conflict-affected areas? What's motivating people to go and where are they going?
Thanks, Vicky. Hello, everyone. Greetings from New Delhi. Am I audible?
Yeah, you keep talking, slowly but surely.
So, I'm really sorry about this world map, because I can see arrows have moved from here and there. So, basically what we wanted to show here, wanted to show origin and destination regions, basically. So, if you can see, Myanmar's arrow has moved. So, Myanmar to Thailand and also to Bangladesh because of recent refugee crisis. And then also we intended to show the workers from India and Nepal are moving to Russia, Ukraine, and also Israel, Palestine. And then within Middle East also we have number of movements around. So these are some of
Rakesh, just before you keep talking, could I get you to speak a bit closer to the microphone? Because at this end you're quite soft, but if we turn your volume up at this end, we'll get a lot of feedback. So can you speak a bit closer to the mic, perhaps?
Just give me a second, sorry.
Sorry about that. You're very soft.
Is it better now?
Moderately.
Moderately.
Okay, anyway, speak clearly and as loud as you can. Over to you, sorry.
Sorry, I hope this is better now. So, very quickly, with this slide, we are very sorry because the arrows have moved a bit, but, hello?
Yeah, keep going.
So, arrows have moved a bit. So basically, we wanted to show origin and destination regions, basically. So, Myanmar workers from Myanmar are moving to Thailand and Thailand and Bangladesh because of recent refugee crisis. Then India and Nepal workers are going to Russia, Ukraine, and also Israel, Palestine. Then also within Middle East and Middle East, we also see some movement. So these are some of the examples. These are not exhaustive. We have not included everyone because otherwise the arrow will become, it will be difficult for us to see all the movements. Very quickly, because we have very less time, I just wanted to emphasize here, and this, I don't want to become philosophical, but still, let's start with little philosophy, where we have to understand migration is the reality of our time. This is a quite layman, quite generalized statement about migration, but the reality is, we have to also move beyond push and pull factors. And this is where I am trying to emphasize here today. Whether it is push or pull, vulnerability has become intrinsic feature of migration. Workers are vulnerable, and most of the times we move beyond workers, and we always consider geographies when we talk about movement. But workers are there. Workers are vulnerable, and there are a number of issues they face. When they move, they go to conflict-affected countries because of number of reasons. So what we did, we have listed some of the regions. We tried to include as many as possible, but there may be many other regions also. So some of the regions which we have listed here, and we have to also consider in the origin countries, most of these origin countries which we have highlighted in the map, one thing is very common, which is economy, like income. Income in the sense, most of these workers lacks employment opportunity in the homeland. Most of the times workers do not have proper employment, and that also forces them to move. And at the end, income is important. And if I can show this advertisement where you can see wage is almost 10 times high than what they can get in India, for example, in India or in South Asia. So I'll just give one example. If workers in India can receive $200 a month, if they are lucky to get a job, but in Israel, the advertisement says if they can get up to 2,000, they can get at least 2,000 US dollars monthly salary. And this is huge. This is 10 times. And this is one of the very important region where safety is becoming less important. Now I'll ask you to read these quotations on the screen, and these are very important. And one of the workers said, risks are everywhere, and we need to take them. So there's how important risk is. The question remains, where is safety? Are they safe in India? Are they safe in Bangladesh? And then why not to go somewhere where safety has become secondary and income became primary? And that's income is very much connected with vulnerability. That vulnerability is everywhere in the origin as well as destination. So that's one of the very important issue we need to understand why workers are moving to these conflict affected countries. And then another thing which I'll mention
Brilliant.
here.
Maybe we'll move on to the next slide where we're covering a bit the challenges that they're facing in conflict zones. And if you could move quickly through that, but try and speak up as loudly as possible because the acoustics for some reason are not very good.
I'm really very sorry. So very quickly, if I can broadly just go to the headlines. Security and risk. Most of these workers are going to work in the conflict zone. So risks are inherent, like they have to face the risk. And most of the time, workers are being restrained. So there are examples where workers were refused to leave. So workers were not allowed to leave the war zones. And most of the times, if they asked to relocate, they were either deported or they were not allowed. We have examples of Nepali workers from Russia, Ukraine, they were not allowed to move. And also many Thai or Yemen workers in Palestine, Israel conflict, where they were not allowed to move. Most of there are also incidents where workers were forced to work very close to danger zone or war zone. That also we have seen, and many people have died also. So one Indian worker went with the recent recruitment, and he died because he was working in very close to war zone. That is also very important. Another one very important I would like to highlight here is all these migration, all these recruitments are basically happening because they are replacement. So they are replacing Palestinian workers. Now we have to also understand how much time they can spend there. If the war if these two fighting countries will have normality, or they will become their relationship will become little better, isn't it like they will be again recruiting the old regular usual workers? Then these new workers who are like dreaming for their higher, better income will have to suffer. So that is also we have to understand. And then again, one very important issue which I want to highlight here: government's role. So there is a huge confusion in India, especially going on about whether this is government to government relationship, or government to businesses, or business to government, or sector to business, or business to sector. So because there are quite confusing statements from government officials in India where they are saying, we are not managing. We have just signed one agreement. Most of these recruitments are being run by business directly. So that is also problematic, because if there is a confusion, if there is a problem in these destination countries, who will do the evacuation? How these migrant workers will be saved? That is also a very important problem. So since we don't have time, very quickly to next slide. So some of the things, and I request Vicky to also add her input here. So we have to also understand in the very second session today, we heard about role of workers. We need to have worker-centric policies. So this should not be just about government to government or business to business, but role of migrant workers should be centric. Their voice and their issues should be addressed by these policies. And then again, authorities, those who are managing all these events, should also ensure workers should receive regular information and inputs. And then protection from exploitation is important, because most of the time, which I have mentioned just now, there's no option for relocate, or the workers are not being allowed to move from danger zone to safe zone. So protection against exploitation is required. Role of business is very important there also. And sorry, am I audible? Sorry, the screen is not moving. So, and then just before I finish, and we have a number of issues we can discuss here. But just before I finish, I'd like to...
For workers, particularly workers who are sort of exposed to the conflict zone, I think is quite significant, and particularly when they're in the private security function. So I think let's move over to Vincent to talk a bit around migrant workers in the private security space. Thank you, Rakesh. I'm sorry about the audibility to the audience.
Thank you, Vicky. Thanks to the organizers. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a very rich topic, so I hope it's just an introduction, and we should continue this conversation because we have only a limited time to discuss it. And Vicky asked me to introduce the topic of migrant security workers in conflict, more specifically. Before that, she also asked me to present briefly my organization, which is called the International Code of Conduct Association. So some of you probably remember the war in Iraq and the Blackwater incidents, the Nisour Square massacre, where a private military company killed Iraqi civilians on a square in Baghdad. That was at the time the start of a reflection on the governance and regulation of the growing private security and military industry. This industry keeps growing, it's still on, and it's still involved in conflict situations. So at the time there was a need to involve companies in this governance and to create a code to which companies could adhere to. Not only governments, but the companies themselves. And so this code was created in 2010, and a multi-stakeholder initiative composed of governments, companies, civil society was created a few years later to operationalize human rights and the laws of war to private security companies. So ICOCA, or this association, is probably the only organization which has an operational dialogue with the private security industry in the field on their respect for legal obligations. And we translate these legal obligations into guidance, codes, trainings. We help companies reach those standards, and then we certify those companies and then monitor how they implement the codes. So for clients which contract private security companies, basically all companies are today, or virtually a vast majority of companies are dealing with private security in a way or another. So for clients of private security companies, we are a risk reduction mechanism because we make sure that those private security companies uphold international standards when it comes to human rights. And it's not only about the relations with the public, it's also about the way they treat their own staff. Because we think that actually poorly treated people will tend to treat others poorly. And we are talking about workers which have access to weapons, resources, which can engage into corruption. So it's critical to make sure that they respect human rights. So just briefly, we touch upon this question of migrant workers, but the issue of migration and private security is much broader. We see working conditions issues also in countries at peace. For instance, with the FIFA World Cup, the condition of the guards working in Qatar came up in the media, and we see that in most countries, the private security industry is really employing, let's say, the lowest category of people in the formal economy, with the cleaning sector. So we have lots of issues also outside of conflicts. We see also private security companies managing migration. And some countries are hiring private security companies to manage migrant detention camps. For instance, in the UK, you had this scandal about the Brookhouse Immigration Detention Center, and we've seen a series of scandals whenever private security has been involved in the management of migration camps and detention facilities. We see private security actually causing migration. We see rogue actors operating in Africa, in other parts of the world, which actually attack civilian population and creates displacement of population. So that's another dimension for the human rights lawyers in the room to consider. And finally, we see private security in conflicts, and we see actually this model of hiring private military contractors to wage war abroad being now a model that other states than the US are applying. So Ukraine has been recruiting, the Wagner Group has been recruiting Nepalese who are going to fight in Ukraine. We've seen movements after a conflict when there is a demobilization, former rebels, former combatants are on the mercenary market and travel from one country to another. Okay, so this is still ongoing, and we still see migrant workers being hired on US bases, for instance in the Gulf region, where they guard facilities. Today we see, for instance, also lots of Ugandans working in Somalia as private security guards around the perimeter of the airports in Mogadishu. So this is still ongoing. It was not only in Afghanistan and Iraq, but it's a model which is now applied in different ways by different countries. However, we should not mix and confuse mercenaries, people who are hired to participate in offensive operations, with private security guards who operate in conflict, who are the vast majority. So I won't speak so much about the mercenaries, okay? First, because it's a category which is prohibited under international law. And here we see specific problems with mercenaries who are often actually highly qualified, highly paid sometimes, not always, but there is a market there. Here we are going to focus on the vast majority of the security workers who are commonly called as third country nationals, the TCN, who were hired or who are still hired to be private security guards in multinational operations, in conflict zone to secure businesses or diplomatic missions. So that's the majority of the guards. Here you see some indicators of their numbers during the war in Afghanistan. In Iraq, you had similar numbers or even more. Actually, the same proportion as soldiers, and sometimes twice, 3 times as many as soldiers were private military contractors. And of course, you had also local contractors. So we see a system which has a kind of racialized setup to provide security around a multinational operation or a military perimeter. They provide escorts, intelligence, logistics, training, advice, maritime security, for instance, against piracy. Nowadays, they are also very much involved in demining in Ukraine, for instance. They are involved in humanitarian demining. They are contracted by the United Nations, for instance, to do this kind of job. They are hired by all types of actors, and more they are also hired by humanitarian organizations, which used to rely on acceptance and now more and more contract private security companies. They fill the gap for armies. They are considered as mostly more cost efficient than running a large military setup. But they're also lowering the political cost. States are reluctant to use conscription, perhaps since the Vietnam War. Even Russia has been reluctant to use conscription, and they recruit in foreign countries private security guards who actually, when they die, don't bring the political cost that your own nationals, that the death of your own nationals bring. So there is this element of political opportunity in hiring these workers. So we see different nationalities which have a reputation as guards. For instance, the famous Gurkhas in Nepal. So it has created a kind of recruitment road from Nepal that Rakesh mentioned. But we see other nationalities being commonly recruited as security guards. And as I said, it creates a kind of racialized system. If you imagine the perimeter of a base in Afghanistan, you would have local Afghan guards at the gates. You would have Nepalese and other nationalities actually in the inside perimeter or on the fence. And inside you would have Westerners, foreign, former special forces, elite forces, who are actually giving the orders and instructions. Now, there are many examples, many incidents. You'll find many in the news. Here you've got an advertisement to recruit guards in Uganda for Somalia. We had the case of Nepalese guards being caught in this evacuation. Some Nepalese guards forgotten there, being stuck in an hotel, who had been recruited to serve as private security but were left behind. So we had one of our member company coming to the rescue and trying to bring them back home. Many of those guards actually were brought straight to the conflict zone without having their passport stamped, so they could not actually simply go back to the airport. They would have been arrested on the way. They had no visa, no ground to be there. We see, for instance, indeed, that some of those guards actually died. Some were recruited as security guards, but were involved in suicide attacks, for instance. They were directly targeted. Some also took part in operations which involve violence. Most recently, we had the case of Sudanese men hired as shopping mall security guards, but tricked into fighting for Libya in the Libya civil war. So that's another case, but there are many, many such cases. If you're interested, you could read that book called Under Contract, which describes the journey of the Nepalese and other nationalities into this Afghan war. I interviewed Noah Coburn, and he said it's like the Roman Empire when they used to, bring tribes from beyond the walls to guard their borders, recruiting the barbarians into their own security perimeter. So he made this analogy, which I find quite telling. So what do they experiment? And we've been discussing a lot about the problem, so I won't repeat what others have said. It looks like many of the problems you've identified in other sectors. We are talking about absence of vetting. For instance, Nepalese could be recruited simply on the basis of their physical abilities. We don't know what is their past or their track record. We see the problem of debt bondage, confiscation of passports, disparity between promises and reality. We had a few cases of people being recruited as guards for shopping malls, but ending up in a war zone. Of course, poor accommodation. Maybe they are protecting the base during the day, but in the evening they take a bus and they go to an unprotected area where they sleep. And we are more exposed. So issues like this that you experiment, of course, in a conflict zone. And when injured or when there are casualties, they are not compensated to the same level as expatriates are. And so they are often sent back with a certain amount of money, when actually they could have claimed much more, or they could have been treated in a proper, good hospital, but they are just sent back by the companies which get rid of them. So many, many problems. Here I share with you this graph from our global survey. If you are interested, there are a few copies outside. I won't bring them back to Geneva, please. We had a global survey on working conditions. And we identified, or guards identified in the survey, that that in this sector where there is quite a lot of discrimination, the first cause of discrimination is nationality and ethnic background. So we definitely need to go deeper and study more this question of discrimination within the private security industry. So a few recommendations to conclude. If companies operate in a high-risk environment, there is no choice, they will hire private security companies. And they are doing it. And in those markets, it's largely an unregulated sector, which benefits from the chaos and from the situation of poor governance. So private security is a risk. It's the paradox of security. Because of their situation, they can access to weapons and risks of abuse are high. And migrant workers are particularly exposed in those situations. But the companies and clients are also very much exposed. And we even had to have this kind of dialogue with the humanitarian organizations which don't realize the type of problems that they could face. So there is a huge risk of reputational damage for clients. And actually, we would like to, and I think thank you for the opportunity, to recommend that clients of private security providers look at our procurement guide. So is a link there. And we recommend also that they hire ICOCA certified companies because we do the due diligence and make sure that those companies actually respect human rights. I've also mentioned the private security industry tool set, which was produced by Verité, which is extremely detailed on the question of forced labor. So it's another resource you could use. And finally, we have other resources on the ICOCA website, including this research on working conditions in private security, so have a look, and also a list of incidents involving private security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Bonnie, do we have one good question or not? Any questions?
All right. Hi, Vicky.
Hi, Bonnie.
by that, it hasn't reached the threshold that we use for conflict, but areas of high criminality. And then there's another question. Thinking about migrant workers who are acting in a private security world, do you know how they affect things like when you conduct worker interviews? Does that have a deterrent effect, positive effect in facilitating, coming to that element of trust that is so needed to do meaningful work interviews?
Okay, two great questions for Vincent. And then we have coffee.
Okay, so quickly. On the first point, the code applies to complex environments. It's not limited to conflict situations. So complex environments and instances where you could face higher human rights risks. So it's not limited to conflict situation. Of course, you need less the code in, let's say, a country which has a very strong governance of the private security industry. But still, we see that there are issues related specifically, for instance, to detention of migrants, for instance. Even in a country like the UK or even in Switzerland, we have had issues with private security and violations of human rights. So I would say that there are certain types of environments which require heightened human rights due diligence when it comes to private security. And there are certain indicators that you could face certain problems in some countries. Like, for instance, in some countries, they are allowed to use firearms, not in others. In some countries, we see them involved in detention, not in others. So we will identify certain risks according to different countries. But across the board, we see that their working conditions are poor. And in our survey, 40% of the guards said, in the different countries we're running this survey because we are doing now country research, 40% on average say that actually their poor working conditions lead guards to commit abuses. So it's a cause, it's an explanation of many of the human rights abuses we see in the sector. And I think it's interesting to work on this relation and talk to clients about the risk of contracting private security when the working conditions are so bad that people have no choice but to engage into corruption or other types of practices.
And the question about interviewing guards, doing due diligence in those situations, are there any differences to doing interviews in normal situations?
Recruitment of guards in conflict?
Not necessarily, but more around interviewing around their working conditions, or at least finding out from them what the conditions are that they're facing.
Yeah, it's more difficult, of course, you mean interview for the research, I suppose. It's more difficult in a conflict situation because there is lots of secrecy among the industry. We have members working in private security companies which are members of ICOCA, which work in conflict, and which share with us the incidents they see around them, and which try to make a difference. For instance, this company which rescued those Nepalese private security guards who were lost in Afghanistan, they tell us, about the conditions of others. For us, it's difficult to run interviews across the sector in conflict zones, simply because it would expose the guards and possibly our own team to some retaliation. But when we do monitoring missions, we have like those confidential dialogues with our members, with our partners, in order to get an overview of the situation in the country and identify also malign actors. Because private security is important in conflict area because it ensures continuity. It protects the civilian population. It protects the business. It allows for people to have jobs. So we need private security in those situations, but we need also to have a clear distinction between malign actors and actors operating according to human rights.
Good.
Thank
you. I think that was very interesting, and I think opens up further discussions that we can't get into here around the importance of this industry, because it's 20 million plus people are employed in private security, so it's a huge employer globally. So thank you very much, Rakesh, online, for doing your best. And thank you, Vincent.
Thanks.
And now I think we have coffee for half an hour, correct?
I don't think the microphone's on yet. It is? Okay, welcome back. We're really grateful that you have come back. We've torn you away from your coffee and we're keeping you from your drinks. So we will try to make sure that we have a really productive conversation here today. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our panel discussion on the responsible recruitment of women migrant workers. Today we're going to be exploring some of the experiences of women migrant workers, the issues that they face, and some of the recommendations that we hope might be helpful to help you strengthen responsible recruitment practices of women. As we delve into this topic, it's important to note and frame, and I think we started the day out with the statistic, but I think it's also fitting that we end it with this statistic, is that there's an estimated 70 million women migrant workers in the world, and they're employed in all sectors and geographies. And it's recognized that women migrant workers play an indispensable role in the global economy. They are contributing significantly to development and the prosperity of both their countries of origin and their countries of destination and employment. Yet, despite many of their vital contributions, many women face significant challenges when they are working abroad. They face essentially a triple threat of vulnerability and face challenges due to low wages and low status employment, and because they are migrant workers, and due to the vulnerabilities they face because they are women. So at the same time, we're seeing an increase of women undertake labor migration, and this underscores the need to address the unique challenges and vulnerabilities women face, and to ensure that they experience protection throughout their journeys and are empowered in the workforce. So I'm very pleased today to have an excellent panel with me. I have two of our panelists are here in person, and we have one participating online. I'm going to give a brief introduction and then we'll move into the questions. So I'm very pleased to have Declan Croucher with me here from Fair Square. She's a senior researcher and has over 20 years of experience in human rights campaigning and advocacy. And she has conducted research on topics including corporate human rights due diligence practices, migrant worker rights in the UK and internationally, and sports and human rights. Online, we also have Anne Abunda, a migrant worker and founder of Sandigan in Kuwait. We can see her up here on the screen. She is from the Philippines and she lives in Kuwait, and she is the head volunteer and founding chairperson of Sandigan Kuwait and Sandigan Kuwait Domestic Workers Association. And then finally, we have Agnieszka Razinska, and if I pronounced that wrong, please forgive me. She's a regional program manager at the Foundation Avina and is a human rights specialist with over 25 years of experience in strategies for civil society organizations to support and promote human rights advocacy. And she really has driven quite a lot of social impact and facilitated cross-sectoral partnerships, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. So as we're moving forward, I am going to start with our first question for Marilyn and kind of our first intervention here. She's going to introduce us to a recent report that is quite interesting and was a pleasure to read, that was developed with the Institute for Human Rights in Business, entitled Respecting the Human Rights of Women Migrant Workers During Recruitment, which was recently released this year. Can you tell us more about some of the findings of this report, Marilyn?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you very much to the IHRB for inviting me to speak here today. Just to briefly introduce Fair Square, we are a research and advocacy non-profit working to stop human rights abuses, and migrant worker rights is one of our focus topics. We worked with IHRB earlier this year to review the implementation guide to the Dakar Principles, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. That was a piece of work to mark the 10-year anniversary of the principles, and it was reviewed with a view to adding recommendations on specific actions that businesses can take to promote respect for women migrant workers. And to accompany that, we wrote a short report, as Sarah's mentioned, for businesses on what businesses can do to respect the rights of women migrant workers during recruitment. So in that piece of work, we looked at two main areas: challenges for women migrant workers, which I think Anne is going to speak about, so I'll leave that to her primarily, and protection in law and international standards for those workers. And we made a series of recommendations for business. So we've heard about the number of women migrant workers that there are globally. Many of those women are working informally, and most are from culturally and racially marginalised communities. Women are migrating for work in increasing numbers, and demand for their labour is growing, particularly in agriculture, garment manufacturing, electronics, hospitality, and care work. Most domestic workers are women. So those are the sectors that they are concentrated in terms of sectors that are lower paid. These workers, these women, are often subjected to a range of exploitative practices throughout the recruitment process. So we've talked about recruitment fees here all day. I think it's come up in every session. For women, that's a particular issue because they tend to have fewer resources than men at the beginning of the migration journey. So when they're indebted, they're then more vulnerable to further exploitation. The issues for women start pre-departure, in country and on return. But what we found in the research was that there is a consistent failure on the part of most governments to ensure that their rights are protected and respected. So origin country governments are reliant heavily on remittances from migrants and are often reluctant to interfere with a system that brings economic benefits. Whereas states that workers are migrating to often take a security-based approach. And so factors like the way that gender can heighten vulnerability to exploitation are overlooked. Often what states have done in reaction to reports of abuse is to attempt to place restrictions on women's ability to migrate for work, which has had the unintended consequence of forcing them into higher risk informal channels. Challenges for women migrant workers we found are featuring rarely in the non-binding standards and the guidance on responsible business practices that companies often rely on to formulate their own policies. And so as a result, very few businesses have paid specific attention to those issues. Responsible recruitment requirements, we know, are an increasing feature of public procurement processes. Allegations of abuse can have significant reputational and potentially legal, very serious legal consequences. Meanwhile, proactive engagement, due diligence, and transparency can have a positive impact on companies' reputation, their legal compliance, and their stakeholder and supplier relationships. So in terms of what it is that companies can do, we recommended the following steps, and some of them will be familiar to you. So the obvious one, carrying out human rights due diligence, including supply chain mapping to understand where women migrant workers are present in supply chains, and assessing policies and procedures through a gender lens to ensure that issues facing women migrant workers are front and centre, and conducting gender-sensitive human rights risk assessments. Obviously, investing in responsible recruitment, including committing to the Employer Pays principle, simplifying recruitment processes by directly hiring and encouraging suppliers to do the same. And the other side of the responsible recruitment coin, if you like, is providing decent work for women migrant workers. So that means fair pay, equal pay for equal work, secure employment, and safe conditions. So violence and gender-based harassment in the world of work is a massive issue for women migrant workers. And And there is now the Violence and Harassment Convention, which was agreed in 2019, which defines gender-based violence in the workplace and creates requirements for states to address it. So we would hope that that would give an impetus for further action. But at the moment, it's not really been high on the agenda. Just to close out, then, another key recommendation for us was the need for more women to be employed and or promoted to supervisory and managerial positions, because we find when there are more women in those senior positions, this can help to address discriminatory practices in workplaces. That's a very brief summary of the report, and as I said, the points in the implementation guide give some more detail at the very practical level on the sorts of things that businesses can do.
Thank you. I really appreciate, the practicality of a resource like this. I think that when you're tackling these wide-scale kind of endemic issues that affect so many people, it's important to kind of have something that can give you directly kind of an insight into what's going on. And to maybe segue into our next question here is we have Anne who's joining us online, and she's bringing really critical voice from on the ground, and has been a migrant worker herself, and is working with an organization and leading an organization that represents a predominantly feminized sector of work, domestic work, and often, people in this industry have low wages and informal employment conditions. So I want to turn the time over to her to share maybe a little bit more of a reflection of the on-the-ground experience of migrant worker women and the conditions that you're seeing from women in this sector and that have migrated for work. What are the enduring issues, and can you speak to kind of what you're seeing in regards to their recruitment, Anne?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, IHRB, for inviting me to speak in this session. I am Anna Bunda from Sandigan, Kuwait, an integrated community center, the first licensed migrant organization in MENA region. Our main work evolves in case handling, organizing, representation, capacity building, collaborate with local and international organizations that can support our work, especially when it comes to regulation and policy change. We work with different nationalities such as Filipino, Nepalese, Ethiopians, and different African communities from Sierra Leone, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Kenya, and Cameroon. We are also working with transnational organizing. So when it comes to the trends, the MENA region is experiencing increased migration, particularly of women, migrant workers from South and Southeast Asia, and in East and West Africa. Ongoing policy reforms, including changes to the kafala system, as claimed by some countries in the GCC especially, which all we know that kafala still exists. New labor laws which aim to provide better protection for migrant workers are questionable when it comes to their implementation. Some countries in GCC and MENA still exclude migrant domestic workers in the labor law, or rights of the sector are unspecified. Advocacy and support networks are also growing, with NGOs and organizing working to raise awareness and improve conditions. However, challenges persist, including the kafala system, lack of legal protection, long working hours, poor living conditions, limited access to healthcare, and social isolation, leading to mental health issues and economic exploitation. Despite these challenges, there have been notable improvements through international collaboration and efforts to empower workers. The recruitment experiences of women are influenced by the policies and regulations in their countries of origin. It is already mentioned by the first speaker. Unfortunately, many labor-sending countries lack sufficient regulation for recruitment agencies, resulting in various challenges such as human trafficking, illegal recruitment, dissemination of misleading information, high recruitment fees, and insufficient protective laws. Lack of training prior to departure and upon arrival, as well as pre-employment training with a focus on safety, fairness, and issues related to migration. It is also important to consider cultural awareness. which we see as one of the factors that affects the situation of migration. There are still other challenges that women migrant workers face when working in certain countries. This includes the lack of diplomatic representation, unhelpful embassies, difficulties due to language barriers, limited knowledge of their legal rights, and the inability to assert their own rights. Additionally, the kafala system in many countries in the Middle East and North Africa ties a worker's residency to their employer, creating an imbalance of power and independency. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks. I think that's really important to note some of these systematic issues that you flagged here, and that when there's misunderstandings of kind of gender and cultural roles in countries of origin and destination, as well as regulations that aren't cohesive, it has impacts on workers, and particularly in a sector like the domestic work sector, this can have, detrimental effects on someone's employment experience, particularly when it's not managed, or there's no oversight or corporate policy that can really capture that, because it is such a different sector of work. If I can maybe spring a follow-up question on you, Anne, I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate very briefly on, are there additional things that you're finding that women are facing in their day-to-day? Are you seeing discrimination? Like, are you seeing, women come with more issues than other migrant communities in Kuwait? And can you speak to that very briefly?
Yes, especially for domestic workers, we encountered, since one of the focus of our work is case handling. So we work with a lot of women who are suffering with different kinds of abuse. In Kuwait, we have, not only in Kuwait, but in GCC, we have levels of discriminations. Like if you are an Arab woman, there is a discrimination compared to if you're a Filipino or an African. So when it comes to access to justice as well, most of the African communities, they are not, African women especially, they are not being entertained properly because of discrimination. So there's a lot of things that needs to work on, especially on the ground, when it comes to gender sensitivity training and a lot of things. Thank you, Sarah.
Excellent. And that's an excellent point as well, is that we also can't view women as a monolith or a single population, that they experience, like women have diverse experiences and they're experiencing other, factors into this. And so I think that it's making sure that there's an intersectional approach to also looking at these issues and looking at even the gender dimensions of this. Moving forward, Agnieszka, it's over to you. We've had some introductions to the conditions and what migrant women are experiencing while they're working. And I know that Avina is progressing some really interesting and exciting work on enhancing dialogue and integrating gender into their development initiatives. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about this work and how the Avina Foundation is driving forward impacts for women migrant workers.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everyone. I will confess I have a problem because I brought some notes to share with you, and then I took notes on top of my notes, so we'll see how it goes. But I hope not to confuse you too much. But just to start, Fundación Avina is a global organization with 30 years of work in the Global South, especially in Latin America. And our mission is to drive collaborative processes that bring sustainable change and sustainable development. So among other things, we bring together key stakeholders on the local, national, regional, and sometimes international level to develop a unified vision and a common agenda to solve problems. And we work in partnership with many different civil society organizations. This has been the case for the agricultural migrant worker corridor in Mexico and the US, and in other places of Latin America, Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and also we started a project very recently in Chile, where we have brought together a group of expert civil society organizations in an initiative called Periplo. And I'm so happy that some of them are here, Stronger Together, Verité, Cierto, and others are watching online. And we also have developed a collaborative initiative called Arropa that aims to strengthen the labor system in the textile sectors in Mexico and Central America, that specifically focuses on ending violence against women in the workplace. So as you see, collaboration is key for us, and I'm so glad to hear that for others as well. In previous panels, we heard the same key word, collaboration, and I would love to share more with you offline as well about this work. These initiatives have put women, workers' voices in the center of everything that we are promoting and doing with our partners. And we aim to elevate their experiences and their voices as agents of change. And I think that's key to say that we, along with our partners, are ensuring to create a narrative around women voices and women workers as agents of change. And I think it's important to say what Marwan was saying before, the role of women in the agricultural sector has changed a lot. In Mexico, women are about 23% of the workforce within the agricultural sector, and we're talking about between 2.5 and 3 million people that migrate to work in the agricultural industry. So that's one data and information to think about. And then Joe just shared some data about the H-2A visas with me earlier, about 300,000 workers migrate transnationally every year, and this number is increasing, but only 5% are women. So we are working together with our partners to improve the recruitment system, labor conditions, and discrimination. I must say that it's relevant to mention that when we started this collaborative initiatives, we didn't start thinking from the gender perspective or started working with gender lenses. This has been a learning process, and I think it happens to all of us all the time, that along the way we learn very quickly that we need to incorporate gender lenses in our work. And it's also relevant to mention that internal migration in Mexico in the agricultural sector usually is done within a family. It's a family matter. And people migrate with their families, and sometimes it's the whole community that migrates. So to integrate gender lenses in the practical work that we promote and that our partners do in the communities means to understanding the context, and from a gender perspective, but also cultural perspective and historic approach and practical perspective. So there are many lessons learned from the practical aspect of these initiatives and the work that we are promoting with our partners. Some activities that are included in this project are capacity building in the communities of origin, outreach activities to ensure women workers are given equal opportunity and access to information. Also supporting migrant women workers means working, as I said, with their families and their communities, and to accompany the process of educating the whole community is been a great challenge. The development of educational materials and tools from a gender and cultural lenses. Our partners from the civil society organizations working in the agricultural sector identify very quickly a gap in their own experiences and approaches, and have been developing a guideline for the accompaniment of agricultural workers with gender and non-discrimination perspective that I will happily share with you. So, and many other activities, and just to mention one, a last one, is to ensure and facilitate the participation of women migrant workers in decision making and in national and international forums and events and wherever we go, just to ensure that they are included. And this has been a quite complex experience for us, but also for the women themselves. It's easy to say, it's very difficult to actually do it. So many lessons learned from that as well that I would be happy to share with you.
Thank you. I mean, as you were speaking, I think that an important message that I really picked up on is that there's a learning process behind incorporating these issues. I think that sometimes it can be very easy to turn, gender or migrants into a checkbox exercise. And what I'd want to say, and what I'm picking up here, is that it actually requires a little bit more than that. It requires looking at the communities. It requires looking at the family dynamics and how this is impacting on a broader scale. And I think that that's really, really important to be able to take that context and that history and to really create kind of meaningful initiatives. And so I think we'll dive a little bit more into the realities of that as we go forward. But I wanted to turn back to Marilyn here. You've given us a brief overview of this report and some of the insights on it, and we've heard some more background and some other initiatives. But I know a key piece of the work that you have been doing was elaborating and looking at some guidance on the DACA principles, which I believe are in their 12th year, and to strengthen their responsiveness and include, some information on how women's issues and gender issues could be incorporated into that. So can you tell us how these principles and some of this new information can be utilized for businesses, and what some of the key recommendations you would give for businesses that are seeking to advance the rights of women migrant workers?
Sure, yeah. So the principles, as you say, were already out there. They're well known. I think they're well established. And it was on IHRB's initiative that the review was undertaken. So I think that the fact that they'd been there for 10 years in and of itself meant there was some learning, anyway, even if we hadn't been doing the review. A lot of the principles are of general relevance anyway. They are quite general. They're meant to be quite general. The principles are high level. The implementation guide gives a bit more detail, but it's not designed to be a kind of tick list. It's designed as a starting point. So I suppose to pick out one area in particular where we were able to kind of elaborate a number of additional points, it was around company policies and practices. So as I mentioned, the idea of reviewing policies with a view to thinking about their appropriateness to women migrant workers and the particular issues facing women migrant workers, and the same for company practices. So where might companies take additional measures to improve their respect for women migrant worker rights? So for instance, in the handling of grievances, in some instances, women may be more comfortable speaking to other women. Is that there? Is that possible? who did women want to speak to? You know, did businesses understand that? So that was one. On others, I've already mentioned, and this was not in the implementation guide, so we kind of expanded it, I think fairly significantly there. It was around employing more women at supervisory and managerial level, because that can have a very significant impact on the culture of a business. And that was not there in the Dakar principles. It wasn't there in the implementation guide. And I think we really kind of moved that forward. It seems a really obvious one, and perhaps that's why it wasn't really considered. But as we've said, as there are more and more women, migrant workers, and women in general entering the workforce, one, it's important that they get the opportunity to be promoted and to advance, but also when there are women there at higher level, they can start to change the culture throughout the business. Some of it was a lot more granular, some of what we did in the implementation guide. So there were quite significant points relating to health issues for women migrant workers, the importance of health insurance, the importance of maternity protection for women, the importance of making sure that women can access social security coverage, particularly because in lots of countries they're excluded from labour law. Some of it also related to much more practical things like accommodation, making sure that accommodation was appropriate and safe for women. So it really was quite a wide range and at different levels of intervention.
I think that's really important, though, to note that you can have the top line principles and have an understanding of those, but then apply them in new ways and add additional information and add guidance. It's almost like we're not reinventing the wheel, but we're pointing it in new directions. And I think that that's really important in order to make sure that we're capturing the diversity of migrant experiences, including the experiences of women. And I think that I also just want to pick up on, women as supervisors and having, more women have opportunities to be in leadership roles can also enrich a business's opportunities, even if it is with migrant workers, even if it is with, low wage or low skilled category workers. Having women represented at higher levels can help include their issues more and more. So thank you for sharing more about that. I want to move down the line here. So I know that Foundation Avina is a funder, and they support many of these types of initiatives. And you can play a really strong role in this in driving forward the agenda of responsible recruitment and incorporation of gender into initiatives with a wide range of stakeholders. So I want to kind of pick your mind and have your reflections on how you feel stakeholders can develop stronger alliances and partnerships to promote equality and address gender systematically in their initiatives. And what do you see as being some of the key actions for the private sector to ensure that these alliances are not just talk shops and that there's actually impact coming from them?
Thank you, Sarah. Well, first of all, we believe that funders play a critical role in supporting intersectional approaches to solutions and systemic change, and incorporating new approaches to our work takes time, takes resources, and more flexible funds are needed. So that's something to think about. And if there are any funders in this room or watching this forum, please take this into account when funding initiatives that tackle this agenda. And I think philanthropy in general has evolved greatly in the last few years, and there's also many collaborative initiatives among funders. And corporate donors are coming together also to seeking more to improve impact and improve results. But I think one lesson learned from the initiatives that Fundación Avina is supporting is that building trust is one of the critical elements for success and for building multi-stakeholder spaces. And building trust, it sounds complex and challenging, and it is, but it's possible. So it takes time, it takes a lot of work, but through the initiatives that I described earlier, there's a remarkable collaborative processes that has been set in motion amongst our partners, the civil society organizations, but also it includes a multi-stakeholder dialogue within a community of practice on human rights due diligence in Mexico. And this is a platform that brings together civil society organizations, businesses, and workers. And so it's a space that is fostering this environment where they can freely exchange information, discuss challenges that all the stakeholders face, and share best practices. And we all know that businesses are responsible for respecting human rights, but they also have valuable experience, resources, access to information, and access to workers. And they often are the ones that have the data on how many workers are actually employed within the labor system. In the case of Mexico, for example, we don't have public data on that or public information. So it's very important to take that into account. I also would like to share that our partners from Periplo project in Mexico have come together and developed a portfolio of services to support employers with materials and practical tools that they already had individually, but sharing those and having a common vision and a common space to approach businesses, it's a game changer. So I think we also have a similar experience just 2 weeks ago in Guatemala, where we coordinated with IOM a participative workshop where recruitment agency were part of the discussion. So I think examples like that are available. We could talk more about that, and I'm sure everyone would have something similar to share. But I just wanted to pick up on the last thing you said before, at the end of the previous intervention, that the participation of women workers in identifying solutions to the problem affecting all workers, specifically women workers, is a priority, and it's not an option anymore. And yeah, it's a learning process, but we have already a lot of information, a lot of tools, materials, experiences. And maybe a key message for businesses would be just reach out to us, to whoever you want from this room, and you will find a solution. And I would end saying that when we build multi-stakeholder spaces, it's a great opportunity. We cannot keep talking to ourselves, and that is not the way. We've seen it. It doesn't work. We need to open the room for others, and that means sometimes have very uncomfortable conversations and have, open our doors to others and share, and that takes courage. So I invite you all to do that.
That's an excellent message. I think it takes a lot of bravery to be uncomfortable. And I think that with some of these issues is that we always want to believe it can never happen here, or we're never going to be doing this, or of course we have these principles and these values, but it takes a lot of bravery to kind of look at these things and counter them. And it also takes a lot of bravery to share and to exchange experiences about this. And I think that that is really kind of key. The thing that I've picked up from your intervention here is the importance of sharing learnings on these intersectional approaches. And I would even say, taking it a step further, is that there is a potential for the private sector to not only be considered as the one who has a responsibility to look at these issues and to remediate them where they exist, or but they have the potential to be an innovator in this space. Because you're right, they do have the information, they do have the experience and the opportunities, and they also have the resources to undertake new initiatives and to maybe drive forward this action. I'm going to move on to Anne, who's online with us, hopefully still here, and noting your work and advocating for migrant worker rights and elevating migrant worker voice. And I wanted to question, what are some of recommendations to businesses to better understand and engage with their women migrant workers, and how to engage with their workers more closely? Do you have any recommendations or advice for us?
Yes, Sarah. Actually, I have prepared some recommendation as well as on how the business community can strengthen the inclusion of women's issues into increasing movements, enhance workers' engagement, grievances, and remedy system. Because they know what is happening. Workers knows what is happening in the workplace and how to address it. As I have mentioned, Sandigan Kuwait and ICC is working with migrant workers and survivors. We are also working with transnational organizing. We have PNAI, Care Workers Transnational Union, as well as IDWF. We are also operating not only in Kuwait, but as well as in Bahrain. Recently, we have been working with the Global Migrant Workers Network, which is composed of 80 migrant workers and survivor organizations. Majority are women migrant workers. Collecting the experiences of the women migrant workers as well as survivors can influence changes in policy change. We need to include the women migrant workers in the conversation about them. Collaboration with different stakeholders can do a lot of changes, especially in the issue of recruitment. I have recommendations here like equal opportunity policies, promote gender diversity in hiring, promotions, and leadership positions, implement affirmative action where necessary to address historical imbalances, gender-sensitive grievance mechanism, maximizing digital platforms for grievances, designed grievance mechanism that are sensitive to the unique challenges of women. Ensure these mechanisms are accessible, confidential, and trustworthy. Use digital platforms to make it easier for women to report grievances, confidentiality, and track the resolution process. There are some platforms designed in the country of origin, which is not accessible for women, or here in country of destinations, not accessible for women, migrant workers. Here in Kuwait, I can say like most of that platform are in Arabic form. So how can we understand all those things? And it needs a lot of informations like employer's name, employer's civil ID or passport or whatsoever. We don't have access to all those things. So you see, it's disconnected. The platforms, the actions that is being done by stakeholders are sometimes not linked to what is reality. Gender sensitivity training and leadership training for women, awareness campaigns, launch campaigns to raise awareness about women's issues, rights, and the importance of gender equality in the workplace, campaigns about their rights and how to assert it. Regular feedback mechanism, create channels for regular feedback from women migrant workers about their experiences and concerns. Use this feedback to make informed improvements. Enhancing enforcement and accountability system, especially with abusive employers. So why you will deploy a worker to abusive employers or company that doesn't follow the rules or doesn't follow the laws. Fair compensation, ensure equal pay for equal work by regularly reviewing and adjusting salary structures to eliminate gender pay gaps. Or sometimes the salary and benefits depends on nationality, which is very, very rampant here in GCC or in MENA region. It always depends on nationality. If you are from this nationality, your salary is high, and if you are from this nationality, you are low. So career development, provide opportunities for career advancement and professional development tailored to the needs of women. Online training modules that can be accessed by women migrant workers for retooling or upscaling. Data analytics. Use data analytics to identify patterns and trends related to gender issues in the workplace, helping it to inform targeted intervention. This is very helpful in identifying the problem encountered by the women migrant workers in the country of destination. By addressing these issues, it can significantly improve the lives of women migrant workers and ensure we are treated with dignity and respect. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. I think that's really important, and I feel like we've just gotten a list of things that each could have their own session. It's incredibly valuable, but I will just pick up on one thing that it's important, and I think you mentioned this, is having feedback that is meaningfully used and making sure that engagement with the workers isn't just happening at a surface level and that it actually is incorporated and means something. So I am going to hand over the rest of our time to the questions, hopefully coming in from online. And if you're here in person with us, please feel free to use the platform to submit any questions.
All right, hi. So I thought I was not going to have any questions when you said one of the main findings is having more women supervisors and then upper management. I thought, okay, that's it, we're done. But we do have 4 questions, and perhaps we do it 2 rounds of 2.
Yeah.
So the first question is on context. Why has demand for women migrant workers been increasing? And do we see any changes across different industries? And is there a particular sector you would highlight, for maybe recruiting women migrant workers better, like a positive example? And the second question in this round is, we're talking about recruitment fees. So going back to Merlin's point about a gender lens and it being important, are there studies on women migrant workers reaping benefits of the repayment of recruitment fees? Do we see a correlation in them, attaining higher education afterwards or starting small businesses? Are you aware of such studies? Thank you.
Those were 2 questions.
That was 2 questions.
Wow.
2 whole sessions that could be given.
Go on, Marilyn.
Okay, I'll have a go. I'll have a go. I mean, the obvious one is the care economy. Yeah. Because as populations age, there is more demand for care workers. And at the same time, as women in certain economies become more educated, they themselves go into the workplace. So we see that, you can see that in Europe now, and you can see it across Europe now, not just in Western Europe, but you can also see it in places like Malaysia, where say, an elderly family member would have typically been cared for within the family. Now professional care workers are brought in, and they tend to be migrants. So that's just one example of a kind of growth sector for women's recruitment and a driver behind it. Is that?
I mean, I think that answers somewhat. I mean, we could talk, I think, all day about various industries and how they're incorporating women migrant workers. I mean, I think down here we were talking about agriculture earlier as it being kind of more emerging, but I know that hospitality hires a significant amount of migrant women workers. I assume that manufacturing, we're also seeing this growing, particularly in apparel. We also see even in higher skilled categories like nursing, or medical care fields where women are increasingly going into and undertaking migration to experience that.
The second one was about repayment of fees. Not related specifically to women, but we do see more and more companies now publishing information about fee repayment. And one of the examples that we found when we were doing the research was from Patagonia, the garment company, which had published really quite detailed information into work that it had done to identify what was going on around fee payment in factories it was using in Taiwan. And I mean, it was very much an eye-opener, because I think the project had gone on for 3 years, and it involved them recruiting, I think, 2 members of staff just to focus on really not a large number of factories and just in this one geography. So I guess the issues around that bring us back to the point about the need for collaboration. It's difficult for companies to tackle these issues by themselves. It requires a lot of resources, and the more that they can collaborate, the better. I don't have an example myself of the benefits of people being repaid fees, but if you imagine the situation for these workers, they have borrowed money to leave, often a very impoverished background. They're then in debt bondage, and they're also sending remittances home to support an extended family. So the pressure on people is massive, and they give up huge amounts of their own lives to do this. So I think any way that can be ameliorated is fantastic. And if the debt burden can be lifted off people, they shouldn't be in that debt situation anyway, because if the employer pays principle was implemented, they wouldn't have become indebted in the first place. But I imagine it can be transformative for people. So yes, I mean, let's hope when we come to future forums, people will be able to share examples, more examples of that.
And I want to make sure that we're not ignoring. If Anne, do you have any comments on these questions? I know you're online, so it's a bit more difficult to interject. So I want to make sure I give you the floor.
Yes, actually, I agree with her. It's care economy as well, specifically domestic workers here in GCC and MENA region. So most of the reasons why they are traveling, they're migrating to MENA and GCC is because of there's no job in the country of origin, especially in African communities. And the process is very quick for them to send or deploy domestic workers or care workers here in GCC. So I think that's one of the driving factor that drives most of the women migrant workers to GCC and MENA. Thank you.
Great, excellent. And maybe if I can just add one, other thought on recruitment fees and costs, is that, we might not have as many studies or a plethora of information on the impact of repayment specifically for migrant worker women, but we do see the impact for migrant workers. But I'd also add that there's probably an additional lens, and we have done some research and had some consultations with migrant workers from the International Organization for Migration, where we've seen that women, when they have paid fees and costs, they're actually more likely to experience threats against themselves and their families when they have paid fees or costs from those that might have given them loans. Because they are women, they are seen as more vulnerable by the people that have power over them, particularly financial power. We also have to recognize that women are likely coming into these situations, not always, because we know there's a diversity of experiences, but they're coming in with less resources from the beginning. So they are more systematically disempowered, or may be at the mercy of male family members or community members who have control over the finances and resources. We often hear stories of people selling land in order to, migrate abroad and take a job. Well, if you don't even have access to land in the first place, you're already a step behind. So it's important to consider those things when you're looking at potential repayment, because it might not just be the monetary amount. It might be that they've already started out lower or have experienced other issues. And so obviously we would always encourage any remediation that's happening goes and covers repayment, but goes beyond repayment. I believe we have a little bit more time for our remaining questions.
3 minutes.
2 minutes, so quick answers.
Yeah.
Yes, and then we can go for drinks, right?
Yes.
To celebrate
Yes
day
or
one.
no answer.
Yeah.
So the next round of questions, one is on, do you see a connection, a linkage between the responsible recruitment of women migrant workers and their exercise of sexual and reproductive rights? And the next one is a little bit, I think it pegs quite well to what you raised about what can be done. So many female migrant workers are reluctant to discuss openly their problems in recruitment due to the fear of losing their jobs and social stigma. What can be done? And do you see worker organizing having a unique role in this process? So that would be the last question for the day. Thank you.
Another panel.
And I feel like this question on like stigma and organizing is made for you. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, actually, organizing is really, really important. And we saw that. And that's the reason why we have the Ethiopian Domestic Workers and we have the West African Domestic Workers Association. That's the reason why we created that one, because we know that women are very reluctant when it comes to talking about their experiences, especially when it comes to like sexual harassment or other kinds of harassment that they experience in the house of their employers or in the workplace. Having a support system, having an organization that will help you figure out what can be done to address these issues is a plus factor for migrant workers, especially if you are already in the country of destination. Thank you, Sarah.
Excellent. And we have are there any other comments on that question, or do we want to move to the linkage between, women migrant workers and potential impacts on their sexual and reproductive rights?
I would say on the first one, just a very general comment. As more women are entering the workforce, we need to adapt to their needs and not the other way around. So that's, very basic, but very, you should think about that. The change is coming. It's inevitable. So better do it sooner than later, I would say, yeah.
Definitely. And the last question, I think, is tricky. It's a very difficult one. We have I think, no time left, but if we can just comment briefly, is that women we know that, reproductive and sexual rights are often impacted for women regardless of where they're working, but probably even more so for migrant workers. We know that many women migrant workers are being asked to, in the application process, they're being asked if they have children or if they're married, and those oftentimes are directly linked to examining if a woman is pregnant or, if she's planning on getting pregnant. And obviously we would advocate that there should be no discrimination for that women should have, full bodily autonomy in those situations and the ability to take on those choices without fear that it's impacting their recruitment. But we do know that it is impacting it in many places, and that there is lots of discrimination, even to the level of asking women to provide blood tests in order just to apply for a job. And so these are things that definitely need to be looked at and countered from the very early stages in order to allow for women to have equality. But noting that we don't have any more time, I just want to touch really briefly on something that you said earlier, is that it's not an option anymore to look at these issues. It's not a checkbox, and that women are in the workforce, they are migrant workers, and they are going to increasingly be migrant workers, and it's important to meaningfully engage them. And I just want to thank my panelists for emphasizing that here today, and give them a round of applause.
Thank you, Sarah.
Of course.
Thank you, Sarah, for leading a great panel to finish us off today on a really important subject. The IHRB report that Marilyn referred to can be found on the IHRB website, or if you go on the portal, it's listed there in the resources. That brings us to the end of today, apart from a little drinks reception that we've got lined up for you. But we'll be starting again tomorrow, 9 o'clock sharp. Registration, tea, coffee and croissants available from 8:30. We look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow. Thank you all very much.